In episode 4, we discussed how John Locke's epistemology gave way to skepticism, or rather, it undermined our uncertainty of the external objects we experience. We also discussed deism, defined by religious historian Richard Tristano as a religion of reason and a rejection of divine revelation. And at the end, we wondered how the Campbells appeared unscathed from what Bertrand Russell, that very same 20th century atheist, described as a bankruptcy of 18th century reasonableness. The answer to that query proceeds from the prominence and influence of David Hume's formidable opponent, Thomas Reid, the successor to Adam Smith as professor of moral philosophy at Glasgow University. Reid's common sense philosophy helps explain how some in that Scottish environment regained their confidence in experience based knowledge and remained faithful to the Christian canon of Scripture. Before we move on to Reid, however, I want to correct what I said about George Berkeley, the philosopher and Anglican Bishop of Cloyne. Perhaps I gave the impression that he was some incognito atheist or agnostic serving as bishop when I referred to him as a skeptic. That, however, would have been unfair to Berkeley. After more research, I realize now that his position is more nuanced. In fact, I omitted a point Tristano made in his book, which is the basis for this series of videos. Remember, Berkeley argues that material objects exist as long as they are perceived by a human. The objection then follows that a tree does not exist unperceived. Berkeley answers that by saying God perceives all things. Still, to a certain degree, all this seems skeptical of a world external to the observer. Berkeley rejects the existence of matter without human perception, or that material objects are mind independent objects. But what he says next may seem unbelievable. He argues that materialism, the idea that mind independent objects exist, leads to skepticism, which is what he wants to avoid. How would materialism lead to skepticism? Materialists soon realize that ideas can exist in the absence of external objects. Thus, it's possible for an observer to have ideas alone. With ideas as mere representations of material objects, how then would we know that external objects are represented accurately? And if they're not represented accurately, then we really don't know what these external objects are. Therefore, we are left skeptical, which is what Berkeley seeks to avoid. Philosophers accuse Berkeley of skepticism, but he would argue that he's not a skeptic himself. So, what's the point in all of this? The main point is that Berkeley denies any objective experience of any quality of anything. As we discussed in episode 4, Locke at least declares some qualities can be experienced objectively. Berkeley, however, differed and said all qualities are experienced differently by different people. In other words, all qualities are subjective to the observer. The next step toward this bankruptcy of 18th century reasonableness is the full blown skepticism of David Hume, where preferring one set of arguments over another is not based on logic, but rather custom or feeling, and that would include our idea of cause and effect. With that out of the way, let's move on to Thomas Reid, 1710 to 1796. Reid brings us closer to the lifespans of Thomas and Alexander Campbell. Reid was a Glasgow University professor from 1764 to 1781. Also in 1764, he published his acclaimed opus titled An Inquiry into the Human Mind of the Principles of Common Sense. He ended his career at Glasgow 5 years before Thomas Campbell graduated from there and 7 years before Alexander was born. This is episode 5 of our discussion on Richard Tristano's masterpiece titled The Origins of the Restoration Movement, An Intellectual History. The book's out of print, and a rare used copy may be expensive, but fortunately, a full-text PDF is available online. I'll also post a link to the text in my video description. All this is courtesy of the library at Abilene Christian University, which includes a restoration movement page full of many wonderful and free resources. As we see from Tristano, Reid, surprisingly, was a convinced Berkeleyan until Berkeley's skepticism was realized in Hume. You may recall some of the epistemological ideas of John Locke, who died in 1704, 6 years prior to Reid's birth. Locke is known as the father of empiricism. Empiricism is today the scientific way we come to know by gathering data and reflecting upon that data. Unlike many philosophers throughout the centuries before him, Locke denied that ideas are innate. Instead, our mind is a blank slate at birth. Had Locke lived another 6 years and visited the Reid family at the time of Thomas's birth, he would have happily declared to his exhausted mother that her newborn's mind is, at this very moment, a blank slate. Well, maybe not. Locke says we gain ideas over time through experience, which is made up of sensation and reflection. Next, we determine which of those ideas agree or disagree. Once we make those determinations, we gain knowledge. But Reid argues that our minds are not a blank slate, aka a tabula rasa at birth. In a world of Berkeley and Hume, Reid may consider he's putting an end to all the madness. We have a knowledge that precedes experience, aka a priori knowledge. In the midst of this madness, years after Locke denies the existence of innate ideas, Reid recovers his knowledge and calls it common sense. It's amusing and perhaps quite fitting that the philosophy countering the skepticism that undermined the existence of external objects is named, quite simply, common sense realism. To argue the existence of this common sense, this a priori knowledge, Reid, beginning on page 19 of Tristano's book, strikes at the root of the problem of skepticism. He argues that Locke, Berkeley, and Hume inaccurately define the meaning of the word idea. We average Joes know what an idea truly is, Reid would say. Simply put, it's something we conceive in our minds. Unlike the average Joe, Reid says, the skeptics falsely identify the idea as the object of perception itself. For example, if you're holding a mobile device right now as you watch this video, our 18th century skeptic friend from Great Britain may question your certainty that the device is resting on the palm of your hand. He may say to you the following: you perceive that you feel that mobile device exists independent of your perception or mind as you hold it in your hand. But actually, that mobile device is simply a complex idea in your mind. Therefore, if it's not an idea in your mind, it doesn't exist. That level of skepticism, as preposterous as it may seem, logically follows if the sensible object, that mobile device, is misidentified as an idea in your mind rather than as a mind independent object. That device doesn't exist if your mind doesn't exist to perceive it. So, the skeptic's definition of idea is one critique Reid holds. Another critique of Reid's, mentioned by Tristano, is Locke's definition of knowledge as the agreement or disagreement of ideas. Instead, for Reid, knowledge is, quote, a complex of image and belief. Quote, the image or conception of an internal object is accompanied by an intuitive belief or judgment, which is not just a message sent to the mind by the senses, but is also an a priori enrichment and validation of sensory information proved by a strong and irresistible conviction of belief. Unquote, pages 19 through 20. Here I'll try to explain what Reid is saying, that prior to experience or a priori, there's this knowledge that enriches and validates what we are sensing at the moment. Reid gives the illustration of suffering from gout, a portion of which Tristano quotes on page 20. With gout, Reid feels the pain in his toe. That would be the sensation. He has a priori knowledge that enriches and validates this sensation, proven by this strong and irresistible conviction of belief. The very nature of the sensation, as Reid says, contains the belief that there is some disorder in his toe which occasions it. In other words, he's not comparing, as Locke would, the agreement or disagreement of ideas to ascertain the knowledge that he has gout. Instead, his a priori knowledge, along with his senses, tell him that something is wrong with his toe. So let's examine more specifically what Reid means by this common sense. Reid explains that we have what he calls original and natural judgments, independent of our five senses. It is God, in fact, who gives us this understanding. Quote, original and natural judgments serve to direct us in the common affairs of life, where our reasoning faculty would leave us in the dark. Unquote, page 20. These original and natural judgments, Reid says, make up our common sense. This common sense is self-evident. If God didn't give it to us, then we would be lost. Even reason would fail us. What is reason? For Reid, there are two degrees of reason. The first degree is what we discussed already, common sense. It is the judgment of what is self-evident. It is what Reid calls the gift of heaven. But we cannot proceed to the second degree if we don't have that first degree, that common sense given by God. Once we do, however, we are able to reach that second degree where we draw conclusions of what is not self-evident from what is self-evident. In other words, for us to conclude something not self-evident, we must utilize what is self-evident. It's understandable at times to doubt the existence of this common sense when we hear others say or do something irrational. But for Reid, common sense was as certain as death and taxes. In fact, for Reid, we can't expect the mathematician to be a better judge of first principles or those things derived from our God-given common sense than the average Joe. It is, quote, highly unreasonable to say that we have deviated from the truth in things which are self-evident, unquote, page 20. Thus, it's not experience that allows us to know what is self-evident. Instead, God has given everyone this common sense, this source of first principles, which precedes any experience. And now to our final point on Reid's epistemology. Contrary to Hume, his philosophical nemesis, Reid says that the argument for intelligent design, essentially, is a first principle. In other words, it's self-evident simply because we may infer design and intelligence due to marks or signs of it in the effect. This is Reid's argument from final causes. It is also what we often refer to as the teleological argument. Teleology originates from the Greek telos, which means end or goal. In other words, teleology seeks to know to what end or goal the creation of a thing serves. Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, also calls this the final cause. The efficient cause, or the maker, created something to fulfill a final cause. Don't get hung up on the word cause there. Essentially, for Reid, as well as for many philosophers for more than 2 millennia, not everything is contingent. Human beings, for example, are contingent beings. Our being is a contingent upon, that is dependent upon, another being. Reid says that contingent beings either might or might not be, while a necessary being must be. I mention Reid's teleology because he refocuses our attention away from Hume's skepticism of cause and effect. For Reid, there is a cause and effect, and we don't extend back to a series of infinite causes. Eventually, there is one necessary being who is the first cause, the source of everything. That would be God himself. Now, those under the influence of Reid instead of Hume gained a newfound confidence in something they could not sense but could assert exists. Common sense, our a priori knowledge, gives us a first principle, one that is self evident, which says that we can be very certain of God's existence since we infer design and intelligence from the mark or signs of it in effect. Along with this recovered confidence Reid students had in sensory knowledge comes another recovered confidence in the existence of God. All of this confidence isn't derived from experiential knowledge. Rather, its source is this God given common sense or first principles. This Scottish common sense philosophy, according to Tristano, would later be found among the intellectual elites at the turn of the 19th century within a new nation called the United States of America. In this new world, we now have reason for optimism. Scientifically, we can make advances since we have regained our confidence in the empiricism of Locke, trusting our sensory knowledge. Religiously, we can make advances toward Christian unity. We can trust our senses when we analyze the data found in divine revelation, the Christian canon of Scripture, the Bible itself. We now have what Alexander Campbell would later refer to as the, quote, offspring of the same supreme intelligence, the twin sisters of the same divine parentage, unquote. Those twin sisters, having God as their father, are nature and religion, as found on page 23. Scientific advances were less of a threat now for these followers of Reid's philosophy. They would no longer be a source of doubt for the divine inspiration of the Christian canon of Scripture. Rather, as long as Christian leaders methodically came to know their religion by way of Christian data, which is the divine revelation of the Christian Bible, while avoiding any theological speculation, such as the scholasticism or metaphysics of the Middle Ages, then, like the scientists of nature, these scientists of religion would advance this world towards unity, which in turn would advance it closer to its creator. This is where we get the impetus for the Restoration movement or the Stone-Campbell movement, the root source of today's Church of Christ, entrenched 2 centuries ago. Join me next time as we'll discuss exactly how the Restorationists found inspiration in common sense realism.